Everyone, welcome to Curiosity. Let's solve question 1321, restaurant growth. The question says you are a restaurant owner and you want to analyze a possible expansion. Assume that there will be at least one customer every day. We need to compute the moving average of how much the customer paid in a 7-day window. This average is called the average amount and it should be rounded to 2 decimal places. We also need to return the result table ordered by visited on in ascending order. Let's look at the example that the question provides to try and understand the question a little better. So we have the input table customer with 4 columns: customer ID, name, visited on, and the amount. We can observe that the first record in the desired output has the date as 7. The reason why 7th is the first date in the desired output is because 7th is the first date from the input for which we can calculate a 7-day window. What this essentially means is, for example, if we consider the date of 4th, there are only 3 days prior to 4th, and that's the reason it is not possible to compute the 7-day window on the date of 4. Similarly, it's not possible to compute the 7-day window on the date of 6th, and hence 7th is the first day from the input table for which we can compute the 7-day window. Now, if you look at the second column in our desired output, the amount column, the amount is computed by aggregating the amount across the entire 7-day window. So the amount is on the 7th in the desired output is aggregated from this 7-day window. So all the amounts here are aggregated to give 860. And finally, the average amount column is simply the average of the total amount across the 7-day window. So if you do 860 by 7, you get 122.86. So I've laid out the approach that we're going to use to solve this question, and I'm going to start writing the query, and I'll explain the approach that I'm going to take as I write the query. I'm going to start with saying select star, using star as our placeholder, from the customer table, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do group by visited on. The reason why I'm grouping by visited on is because we could have multiple users or multiple customers who are visiting the restaurant on that day. For example, we could have 5 customers who are visiting the restaurant on 7th. So we need to aggregate the amount for all customers visiting on 7th. So I'm going to say group by visited on, and the question asks us to return the table in ascending order of visited on. So I'm going to say order by visited on, and it's going to be ascending by default. So now let's try and build the output table that is required. So the first column that we need is the visited on column. So I'm going to say visited on, and for the second column I am going to say so now that we have grouped all the customers on the visited on column, I want to compute the sum of their amount or aggregate their amount. So I'm going to say sum of amount. So this is going to calculate the aggregate amount for all customers visiting on a particular date. So if 5 users or 5 customers visit on 7th, this is going to calculate the sum of all the different amounts that they have spent. But an important thing to remember here is we also need to aggregate across the 7-day period, right? So across the 7-day period, to do that I'm going to do sum again, and this outer sum that we have here, this is going to act as a window function. So I'm going to say over rows between. So this is our window. So the window is 6 days. So 6 preceding and current row. So this is going to help us create that 7-day window. And let me just correct this. Okay, so I'm going to alias this particular column as amount because that is what the question says. This has to be amount. And the next column is going to be the same thing, but instead of computing or aggregating the amount across the window, I'm going to calculate the average across the 7-day window. So it's essentially going to be the same thing, and except instead of sum, I'm going to replace it with the function average. And an important thing to note here is that I think it mentions the average should be rounded to 2 decimal places. Yeah, so we need to round this to 2 decimal places. So I'm also going to wrap this in a round. This entire thing is going to be rounded to 2 decimal places. And let's alias this column as average amount as the question suggests. Okay, so we have the 3 columns that we need, but I'm going to also create another column, and I'll get to why I'm creating this column in a bit. So I'm going to create a column with the function lag, and I want to lag the visited on date. So I want to lag this column. I want to lag it by six days, right? So I'm going to say 6 over, since it's a window function, and alias this as something called as start date. Okay, so I'll come back to why I've created this column, but for now let's go ahead and try running this query to see what we get. Okay, great. So this is our output that we get from the query. So we see that the amount, let's look at it from this row. So we see that the aggregated amount on 7th matches what is expected, and similarly the aggregated amount matches for all the rows that we have here. We also see that the average amount is correctly computed with what is expected. Now what we can observe is we need only the rows, we need only these rows, right? These are the only rows we need, and that is the reason why I've created this column called start date. So start date is going to be null for all the dates, all the visited on dates for which we cannot compute the 7-day window. So for all dates up until the 6th, we cannot compute the 7-day window, and hence the start date is going to be null. And from here, since we are able to compute this 7-day window, the start date is essentially the start date of that window period. So now that we have it, all that we need to do is we need to filter this table that we have to find only records for which the start date is not null. And to do that, the first thing that we can do is that we can create a common table expression. So create common table expression. And I'm going to say we're going to use this common table expression. So I'm going to say select star, using star as a placeholder, from the common table expression where start date is not null. So this is our filtering that we are doing. So we want only the records where the start date exists and is not null. And the columns that we are interested in is the first column, visited on. We are interested in amount, and we are also interested in average amount. We do not need to print the start date in the output because it's not asked of us. So I'm going to go ahead and run our query to see if we are getting the desired output. Okay, so the test case passed. Let's go ahead and submit this query. Okay, great. Our solution is accepted and the runtime is also really good. So that's how you solve this question. The trick is to understand how you can use the inner sum and the outer sum, similarly the inner sum and the outer average, and how both of these can be used along with the window function with having 6 preceding rows and the current row. So thank you everyone.